Welcome to the Armada EW podcast with your host Tom Withington at the controls. The ongoing war in Ukraine has placed cyber warfare firmly on the agenda. Cyber threats and attacks are a staple of the evening news, yet the nuts and bolts of cyber warfare seem to go undiscussed. A new book by Daniel Moore called Offensive Cyber Operations: Understanding Intangible Warfare is an important contribution to our understanding of offensive cyber operations. Daniel holds a PhD in war studies and is an internationally renowned cyber warfare expert. He joins us today from London. Daniel, thanks for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Daniel, tell us about the central message of your book.
As you mentioned, there's quite a lot of discussion around cyber warfare, and it usually happens along many titles. Some folks call it cyber warfare, some call it cyber operations. Sometimes we see this under sort of the looming specter of cyber war. The problem is that there really isn't any nuance or separation to the discussion. And one of the things my book does is basically look at what does it actually take to be successful in cyber operations? What do they actually mean in the context of military operations? And specifically, how do different nations go about employing them within their respective conflicts or areas of interest? So it starts off with a more theoretical section around looking at the distinction between cyber warfare and other forms of operations, because one of the things that we often see is people lump together every single thing that happens online into the same sort of mass of cyber war, where in reality, the vast majority of cyber operations are not offensive in nature. They are intelligence capabilities or intelligence operations, and only a smaller subset are actually attempting to achieve any effect against their target, and an even smaller subset of those are used within the context of active conflict or war. So it is important to make the distinction because there's a difference between the capabilities that are used, who's carrying out the operations, and the objectives that are being pursued. I think one of the more interesting distinctions that I'm looking at in the book is how did nations become good at doing this, right? There are different type of lineages that countries draw from when they establish their capabilities. And if you look historically at nations that are potent in conducting offensive cyber ops, like Russia or China or the United States, you can see a very strong culture around signals intelligence, electronic warfare, and the ability to use those effectively within the course of conflict. So noting how a lot of the unique or supposedly unique characteristics of cyber operations today, they actually draw from the tenets of electronic warfare, signals intelligence, like the desire to have excessive amounts of intelligence in order to create tailored capabilities that align with your targets, or the concern that if you excessively use a capability against your adversary, you might expose it and use it because you cause an adjustment on your target side, or the need to fundamentally upset the trust between your adversary and the devices and networks that they use. So there are quite a few commonalities there between cyber warfare and other forms of capabilities that we've seen in the past. So that's one piece. The other piece is actually looking at the full life cycle of a cyber operation, because usually what we see is sort of the tail end of it, right? The actual effect when it gets discovered or activated. And then we analyze the tools and say, oh, this was a complicated attack, or this was a relatively straightforward operation. But really, in order to be truly successful at scale continuously in an integrated way with offensive cyber operation, it takes a great deal more participants than one would usually see. So that can be intelligence officers that are required to support the operation. That could be various levels of technical support, from creating the right operational infrastructure to developing tools to conducting research and development against the targets to researching software and hardware vulnerabilities and having the operational capacity to orchestrate all that in unison. So the actual needs to have a robust and elaborate mechanism to facilitate cyber ops is far more extensive than what we usually see. And it's important to acknowledge this because this is what explains to us why some countries are better at this than others. Once we establish that, I talk a little bit about how it fits in actual strategic planning, when and where the different types of cyber operations make sense. Some of them, for example, what I call event-based operations are actually much more tactical. They're much more similar to a weapon that you can use in a battlefield, or they draw a lot more similarities to classic electronic warfare. You can put that on a ship. You can put that on a plane. You can have a squad that does this, or you can even do this remotely through some facility somewhere distant from the battlefield. But the gist of it is that they're capabilities that you can package up and use as you need to against a well-defined target to, for example, do a tactical disruption of networks in the field. And this is something that we're seeing a lot of militaries gradually incorporate into their capabilities. And you see quite a lot of the sort of major hitters in the defense industry develop hybrid electronic warfare and cyber capabilities for this type of tactical usage. Then the counterpart is what I call presence-based operations. These are the more methodical, longer-term espionage campaigns that eventually turn into offensive capabilities. They require a deep penetration of enemy networks, establishing yourself, moving laterally within the network, looking for the right targets, doing the research required in order to hit it at the right time, at the right place, to get the cascading effect that will make a difference. These are often, or can be, more strategic in nature. They are usually not as easily reusable, but as a result can have a more tailored and significant effect if used correctly. And the beauty of it is that each one of those approaches has its own unique set of advantages and disadvantages. And if we look at it through those lenses, we can actually decide which capabilities should be under the auspice of which type of military entity and for what reason. And then finally, I take all this and I apply it to 4 really distinct case studies to demonstrate how each country has its own military culture and how significantly that impacts the way that they use cyber warfare in their operations. So I look at the United States, at Iran, at China, and at Russia. And each one of those actors has its own sort of idiosyncrasies in how they choose to employ offensive cyber operations.
Obviously, cyber warfare is very much in people's minds at the moment with the ongoing war in Ukraine, for example. What have you noticed about that aspect of the conflict?
There's a couple of well-defined camps that have emerged in the discourse. One is that we haven't seen the promised cyber war. There is no cyber war. Cyber warfare would sort of be a disappointing myth that did not come to pass, and it played no role in Russia versus Ukraine. The other side said, actually, we have seen unprecedented levels of offensive cyber capabilities brought into play. We had just miscalculated what cyber war would look like, but in fact, cyber operations play this type of support role, and we have seen quite a lot of this on both sides of the fence, both against Russian targets and Ukrainian targets. I probably fall somewhere in the middle. I certainly think that we have observed a high level of offensive cyber operations taking place. And just to give a few examples for this, we have seen on the Russian side, we have seen multiple instances of what we would call wipers or destructive malware targeting various sets of targets within Ukrainian networks to achieve effect. And those are carried out often by Russian military units, and they are loosely aligned with a Russian military objective, but they are not sort of this massive, critical, tightly coupled integrative capability that is directly relevant for battlefield support. The one sort of instance that folks keep referring to that is potentially the most coupled with a direct military agenda is the attack against Viasat, essentially the satellite provider that is a notionally civilian provider, but has also supposedly been used by the Ukrainian military to facilitate some of its command and control. There was a destructive attack there that bricked a lot of the modems used within that company. It also cascaded into the civilian side and impacted civilian customers of Viasat. So that's referenced as an example of cyber warfare, which it is. That said, and we also, by the way, had similar attacks on the Ukrainian side, though the attribution there is a bit more murky, perhaps. We had a very well-known attack against railways, so critical infrastructure used to supply Russian military forces and allow the transfer of troops and equipment, supposedly by hacktivists, but how affiliated they are remains to be seen. And there have been other sort of low-key attacks that have taken place. So I certainly think it would be incorrect to say that cyber played no role or even an insignificant role. I can absolutely say with certainty that cyber played a minimal role in comparison to the kinetic component of the conflict. But this will always be true. cyber by itself is not necessarily a means to achieve an objective. It is a way to enable objectives. So I think perhaps the perception of what role cyber would play was overblown in the sense that it would uniquely afford a Russian victory. But I do think, and this is important to say, that we also haven't seen everything that cyber can deliver by a well-resourced, well-coordinated, operationally active adversary. So just because the Russians are a major player and they have failed to, quote unquote, show up and achieve various sets of objectives in cohesion with cyber, it doesn't mean that it's impossible to do. And if you look at some of the capabilities that, for example, the United States probably has, or maybe even the United Kingdom, and possibly the Chinese, though it is more difficult to tell in that space, I find it highly likely that attacks against military targets through cyber, whether that's tactically in the field or strategically against major networks and command and control components, is likely and useful and meaningful, but we may not see it. We may not have a full notion of the effects of it. And just because Russia hasn't done it or hasn't done so successfully doesn't mean that it's impossible. So it's important to note that cyber has its place in the modern battlefield, and we haven't seen the full potential of it. And both of those things are true and can coexist. So while we have certainly seen a cyber component to Russia versus Ukraine, and we are likely to see more, I would be cautious in suggesting that this is the face of cyber in conflict, and that we're likely to see some notably different things in future conflicts, which hopefully we won't see, but I suspect we will.
Well, Daniel, you've neatly segued there into what is my next question, which is actually regarding those cyber warfare powers, China, Russia, Iran, and the US, for instance, that you were just discussing. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how those actors see cyber warfare and perhaps the similarities and differences between them.
Yeah, so I think this is a fascinating question that is often underexplored. And I alluded a little bit to this at the start of this, where I mentioned that military culture plays a massive role. So the degree to which one has a well-developed signals intelligence apparatus, the degree to which you have expertise in cryptanalysis and experience in conducting espionage operations, the way that your defense industry is integrated into your military capacities, and the proven capability to conduct joint operations drawing from multiple services and capabilities are all really essential. But also just military doctrine plays a major role in this. And we see that bleed into the different approaches that countries employ for cyber ops. So for example, in the United States, with its extensive literature and doctrine, a rich history in the NSA, and a continuous tension between the bureaucracy and the ability to execute complex operations, we definitely see this bleed into cyber operations. So you can see this, for example, through the establishment of Cybercom, declaring cyber as an independent domain of warfare. All those things are emblematic of the American approach to want to put things in neat boxes so that they can be divided as such. In some cases, that's advantageous because capabilities are being developed strategically, and obviously the U.S. has a lot of access, expertise, and a rich history of conducting complex operations. So I would undoubtedly say that they probably have some of the most advanced capabilities in the world, but their ability to employ them at the moment of need is often shackled because of the immense bureaucracies, the amounts of legal frameworks that they have to go through, and basically the amount of hoops that one has to traverse before they're able to use something within a given context. This is one of the reasons why I think that distinction between event-based and presence-based operations, ones that are prepared for military use and ones that are that still require levels of approval, are important. On the Russian side, their doctrine doesn't even acknowledge cyber as a concept. It's all about information. They treat this as a spectrum that on one end has everything related to influence, so your classic information operations trying to shape perception to avoid combat, and at the far end of it there's electronic warfare. So cyber is just one other piece alongside a much richer spectrum, which I actually feel is probably the healthier approach to treat cyber in an integrative way. The other advantage that Russia has is its rich history of electronic warfare and highly advanced capabilities in that sense. So they're quite prepared to fold cyber into that existing tapestry of EW. On the other side, they have some interesting idiosyncrasies in how they conduct operations. And again, that's part of their culture. The aggressive, unchecked nature of their work means that they often just conduct their operations without any notion of collateral or whether even it's fully prepared to achieve its objectives. So what you often see in Russian operations are flashes of technical brilliance, where you see incredibly elaborate technical capabilities that are brought to bear in quite stunningly sloppy fashion. So if you actually look at some of their best operations, whether that's against critical infrastructure in Ukraine or elsewhere, there were a lot of moving pieces. There's clearly a lot of research and development done, some of it bespoke to the specific types of equipment used by Ukraine in the specific configurations. But then the operator comes in and makes a bunch of operational mistakes, exposes the op prematurely, or even as it's being executed, it fails to achieve its objective because of various incompatibilities or incorrectly using the capabilities that they had made available to them. So I would suggest that Russia has immense potential and technical capacity, but it actually often falls short in achieving success because it doesn't know how to operate in unison effectively and consistently. And this is, again, not something that's unique to cyber. We see this all across the Ukrainian campaign, right? A lot of technical capability and military might that's brought to bear in a highly inefficient way, therefore not truly achieving its objectives. The Chinese are interesting because they have clearly learned a lot from others. So in the absence of direct combat experience themselves, they essentially are excellent observers of military culture and strategy around them and take bits and pieces to adopt. So whether that's learning from the Gulf War about the nature of informationized warfare, all the way up to identifying the rise of the interconnected battlefield for their adversaries, and the implication that cyber can have on basically weakening centers of gravity for those types of operations. So they have established the strategic support force, which brings together signals intelligence and cyber and other bits and pieces from across the different areas of the People's Liberation Army, in an acknowledgement that cyber operations need to be coordinated in unison and then disseminated to where they need to reach. So there's a lot of strategic maturity, and they clearly have some technical capability when it comes to, for example, to extensive research on software vulnerabilities, the capacity to do supply chain compromise, and conducting large-scale espionage operations. But their experience in intricate offensive operations is actually quite limited. So there's a big question mark that extends to its entire military, but also specifically to cyber, which is, okay, they have built all this force and all this capability. What is their actual capacity when push comes to shove to execute it in an effective way? So a major area of concern, but also one that's riddled with a few question marks. And finally, I really enjoyed bringing together the Iranian example because it's quite unique from the three major powers. And I think it's an example of a country that punches above its weight. They certainly do not have the best tools. They do not have the best operators, but they often succeed in achieving an effect and creating some kind of perceived deterrence through the notion of just being able to reach out and create destructive effects with their adversaries, whether that's Israel or Saudi Arabia or others in its area of influence. So, and again, you see their operational culture bleed into cyber, because what is the one thing that Iran wants to do most is to extend beyond its border by use of proxies. So in the real world, that could be Hezbollah or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or other entities, and that could be through its Quds Force or others. And you see quite the same thing happen with cyber. They often relegate operational capacities and development to proxies, whether those are commercial entities that are operating with license from space, whether that's its burgeoning activist scene that they have plundered extensively for personnel and cooperation, or whether that's third-party operators in other countries that can make use of their capabilities, whether that's in Lebanon or elsewhere. So that same notion of relying on proxies to carry out their will is something that bleeds into the cyberspace. But again, that has advantages and a lot of disadvantages. It creates a lack of cohesion in their capacity to achieve what it is that they want. It means that things are often sloppy and outside of their direct control. And it generally means that they can point somebody in a direction, but their capacity to achieve really pinpoint specific objectives is limited. So I think Iran demonstrates the concept that I say in the book. You don't have to be the best. You just have to be good enough to achieve what it is that you're setting out to do. And in that sense, they're often doing quite well considering their limited capabilities. So that's notable as well. It's just the ability to create the effect that you want to create. And sometimes that's enough.
Daniel, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You can find a copy of Daniel's book, Offensive Cyber Operations, Understanding Intangible Warfare, at all major online retailers. You can also follow him on Twitter at @ILDannyMoore. Don't forget, there's more electronic warfare news and analysis at Armada International /electronic-warfare. That's all we've got time for, and thanks for listening.